Technobabble. Making your video file size smaller.
This is Tech No Babble, your weekly source for church video and graphics news, perspectives, tips, and tricks. And now here's your host, Paul Clifford.
Hi everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Technobabble. I, of course, am your host, Paul Allen Clifford. Hey, join the conversation. Head on over to trinitydigitalmedia.com/contact, and you can put in your feedback over there or see all the other ways to contact me, including, if you're watching the video, right under my face is my Twitter handle at Paul Allen Cliff, and you can reach me there. That's PAULANCLIF. So, before we proceed, I do want to say that if you are at all interested in streaming like I stream, then really you ought to check out my streaming provider, churchstreaming.tv. Now, the great thing about churchstreaming.tv is they have flat rate pricing. So depending on the size of your church, which I recognize that most churches are under 2,000 people, so you would be in the lowest tier platform at $99 a month. You get unlimited streaming to computers, iOS devices, Android devices, a Roku channel, and video podcasting, all for free, including some other extras like countdowns and maps of where people are. Their customer service is second to none, and they just keep adding feature after feature. So go ahead and head over to trinitydigitalmedia.com/churchstreaming, and you can get a free trial for a month and test them out for yourself. I think you'll be really, really pleased. Also, I want to recommend to you this. My pastor's book, What Life Are You Waiting For? Head over to trinitydigitalmedia.com/whatlifebook, and you can pre-order it at Amazon using that link. This book is phenomenal. I was there for the sermon series that it's based on, and I've heard some of the sample chapters, and I recommend it highly. It's published by Tyndale, I believe, so it's a great quality piece, and it will actually ship a little bit into 2014, so go ahead and get your pre-orders in right now so that you have it when it first ships, and you will not regret it. So, on to our topic for today. Let's talk about making video file sizes smaller. Now, if you're like me, you have all kinds of video files just laying around on hard drives and everything, and you're probably wondering, okay, what file should I save? What file should I upload to the internet, etc.? So, first off, I tend to recommend that you save the largest file, the most editable, my mouth didn't want to work there, the most editable, there's the word, file that you have, and save that on a hard drive. Now, you need to spin up those hard drives at least once a year just to make sure that they continue to work. But with that said, you need to save the most editable version that you can. Now, it could be that you don't have hard drive space, so you have to just save the final copy. That's fine. Just realize you've lost some options then. So if your pastor says, hey, great video, can we just take out the lower third on that video? You can't do it if you have only the final copy. But if you have all the source files, taking out the lower third is simple. It's basically a checkbox, re-render, export, you're done. So that's the first thing I want to say. Now, for delivery, there are some things to keep in mind, and this is going to sound a little technical mumbo jumbo, but I'm going to try and make it as simple as I can. So first off, resolution. If you record in 1080p, which right now is the most popular HD format because it's got the most resolution, it's possible that you don't need that for delivery. So what I'm recording in right now for this live stream is actually 360p. So it's less than standard def, but because it's widescreen, it's 640 by 360, so it's widescreen, people assume that it's high def, even though technically it's not. And not just technically, it's just not. It would fit very nicely on a standard definition TV with bars at the top and the bottom. So it's not high definition at all. But if you wanted to double the resolution in both directions, you'd get 720p. And compared to what I'm doing, that's going to seem beautiful. And if most people are watching it on their computer screen, they're probably not going to take it full screen. So 720p would be adequate. So you might be able to get away with 720p and save you some file size over 1080p. Definitely don't worry about 2K or 4K video. That's, if you're going to show that on a movie screen, that would be great. But for this, not so much. So keep in mind your resolution. Next, frame rate. If you record at 60 frames a second and you're not doing sports, you've got too much there. You don't need that much. So what I would recommend is knocking it down to 29.97 or 30 frames a second. And to tell you the truth, movies are actually shot at 24 frames a second. So you could potentially even knock it down a little bit further and save a little bit of file size in that way. Now, from 60 to 25, that's not an even divisor. There's no least common denominator there, to use mathematical parlance. So with that said, that might not be as easy to do as going from 60 to 30. But it is something you can mess around with. And probably the best way to do this is change each one of these settings that I'm telling you about and see how that affects what you see as you're looking at the file and how it affects the file size. So if it saves 2% of the file size, that may not be worth doing. But if it saves 30% of the file size, hey, that might be worth doing. And some of these things are going to save 80% of file size. I mean, they're just going to really affect things, so keep that in mind. Next is codec. Now, this is one of the big ones. Typically, people edit in larger codecs that are better for editing. This isn't as much the case anymore, but in the past, people would edit in ProRes 422 or 4444, or the Apple Intermediate codec, or DVC Pro, and all those were codecs that had full copies of each individual frame. H.264, for example, saves the difference between frames as opposed to entire frames. So in that way, it's necessary that you can save, you can save a lot of file size that way. So if you have the exact same video at the same bit rate, at the same sample rate, same frames per second, same resolution, but one is in one of these editing codecs and the other is in H.264, for example, you're going to find that you get a remarkably smaller file size. Like the difference between, for a 30-second clip, a gig and a half versus 30 megabytes. So it's going to be just remarkable. So that's probably the first place that I would go. Now, with that said, there are some settings within each of these codecs. By the way, a codec is instructions on how your computer compresses, CO, and decompresses, DEC, the video. So H.264 is a little more processor intensive on the playing computer side, but it's been around long enough that most modern computers, we're talking from XP on, Windows XP on, and Mac OS 10, probably 10.3 on, can handle it no problem. So, with that said, you can affect some things a little bit. You can talk about bit rate. Now, bit rate is how many bits are used to make a sample. That's kind of technical, but the way we used to do it in the old days was analog. So analog was that there was an analogy between a video waveform and an electromagnetic waveform. So you could go back and forth between the two that way. With digital, what we do is we take samples. The larger the sample sample bit rate, the more true to the original it's going to be, as long as you don't eclipse the size of the original file. So if the original sample rate, the original bit rate is, I don't know, 2 megabits per second. If you go up to 3 megabits per second, you're not going to get anything better. But if you go to from 2 megabits per second to 1.5, you might lose some quality, but it could be that it's so subtle that no one notices. So it might be a place where you're even having trouble seeing it. If that's the case, then you're fine, and that will save you quite a bit on your video file size. Now, keep in mind, always trust your eyes on this. Make sure you blow up the video to the final size, not larger, and you compare the original with the compressed one, etc. Now, with bitrate, there are a couple of things that you can do within that. Now, you can do a constant bit rate where the bit rate is always the same no matter what. That's going to be fast and easy, but it won't save you as much as if you do a variable bit rate. Now, what a variable bit rate does is it says, well, the background hasn't changed much, and right now the guy's not moving much, so I'm going to use less data to represent that. And then when there's more movement and the background changes, etc., it's going to use more movement, so it's going to intelligently do that. Now there's a set of settings that are underneath that called single pass and multipass. Now, every time I hear multipass, I even say it a little bit like this from The Fifth Element. Lilo would say multipass, and what that actually means is how many times the computer looks at the file. So it can just look at the file one time through and then be done, or it'll take a little bit longer, but it can look at it multiple times, maybe 2 times, 3 times, and each time try and make it just a little bit better. So multipass takes longer to encode, but it typically gives you a better picture and a smaller file size. So the next thing to consider is sample rate. So we have how much data we use in each sample. That's bit rate. Sample rate is how often we take these samples. So if you want to think of it this way, the more often you take a sample, the more true to the original you're going to get. So if you take a sample once at the beginning of a video and once at the end, those are going to be remarkably different. If you take a sample so many thousand times per second, you're going to get something much more accurate to the original. A sample rate tends to be represented in hertz or kilohertz, by the way, and a hertz is how many times per second. Kilohertz is how many thousand times per second. So if you're a sound person, you're familiar with this. But the higher the number, so 2 kilohertz is better than 200 hertz. But it's also going to take more data. So you can affect your file size by lowering the sample rate. But that might also affect your video size. So we're always trying to get a balance between the two, between sample size and or sample rate, bit rate, file size. We're always trying to kind of massage those, and depending on the type of video that you're doing, one set of settings might work brilliantly, whereas using those same settings on another type of video might not work at all. So if there's a lot of movement, a set of settings where you remove a lot of the frame rate, where you lower the sample rate and the bit rate, might not work as well as if it's a video like the one that you're seeing in front of you, where it's just me talking against a background that isn't moving whatsoever. So you'll get different results with different videos. So you really need to develop a set of settings that work well given what you're doing. Now, Vimeo, for example, if you're uploading your videos to Vimeo, they have recommended settings. So now you can look at those and say, oh, so I know what the bit rate is, I know what the sample rate is, I know what the codec is, because Paul told me what all those are, and I can affect those. Now, you might be thinking, well, how can I affect those? I've got some free software for you. Well, not personally, but this is the stuff that I use because I've got the same budget in my ministry here at Trinity Digital Media that a lot of churches do, which is almost nothing. So probably the easiest piece of software that I use is QuickTime Player. QuickTime Player 10 is the easiest of the two that I'm going to recommend. There's also QuickTime Player 7, which you would think isn't as good, but it's actually better. But we'll talk about that in a second. So QuickTime Player 10 or QuickTime Player X, you can export something, and the only choice you have is the resolution. So you can export it as 1080p, and if your source file is a 1080p video source from, say, Final Cut Pro or Premiere, you're going to find that the exported version from QuickTime 10, even with the same resolution, is going to be remarkably smaller. And that's because it switches it to H.264, and it's got some presets in there for sample rate and bit rate that make it smaller. And most of the time, people aren't going to notice the difference. But again, always preview so that you know if this was a good choice or not. So you'll go from several gigs to several megs, and you'll think, wow, I've saved quite a lot. A gig being 1,064 megs. So if you have a 30 megabyte file at the end where you used to have a 1.5 gigabyte file, and this has happened to me, you have saved a lot in the file size. So that's the first and easiest one to use, but you don't have a lot of control. If you want a little more control, if you're using a Mac, you can download QuickTime Player 7, and that'll have some of these other settings in it. But there are a couple of other pieces of software which, depending on what I'm doing, I also play around with those. One of them is Handbrake, Handbrake. Now, Handbrake, what that is designed for is it's designed to take your movie files and squish them down so that they would be a good size to put onto your iPhone, your iPod, etc. But you can tweak all the settings, and since you can tweak all the settings, that's particularly good for when you're trying to compress your video when you're finally done with it. You can also do the same thing with MPEG Streamclip. Now, MPEG Streamclip, that's spelled MPEG space STREAMCLIP. I typically use that to go the other direction. So if I have an H.264 file and I want to edit that in Final Cut Pro 7, typically what I'll do is I will take I'll take that H.264 and I will transcode it into a ProRes 444 or ProRes 422 LT or something like that format so that it's easier on Final Cut Pro 7. When I use Final Cut Pro 10, I don't do that because Final Cut Pro 10 can deal with H.264 a little bit better. That's one of its advantages that some people are not noticing when they're poo-pooing the interface. So typically that's the way I use MPEG Streamclip, but as I say, Handbrake and MPEG Streamclip are both free, so why not try each of them and see how you can get the best settings. I've noticed that I get a smaller file size with QuickTime Player 10 than I do with MPEG Streamclip, but I get a smaller file size than both of those with Handbrake. So I've taken to using Handbrake for my final compression, but the problem with Handbrake is it doesn't recognize ProRes 422, so I have to take it through a step to get it to H.264 before I can compress it to an MP4 file. That's a wrapper file that is very small and easy to upload to YouTube, for example. So these are all things that you need to play with. What I always say is start with the presets and then play around with some of the settings. Just pick one setting and play around with it and see what happens. If you lower it a little bit and it still looks great and you've saved some good file size, there you go. You now know you can lower that setting. Next time, try lowering another setting and see how the result looks. If that doesn't look as good, you now know, okay, don't lower that setting. You can, if you lowered it too much, you can try splitting the difference. So let's say you chopped it in half. Well, bring it back up 50% and see if that doesn't help you. So that's basically how I would go about it, and you'll eventually develop some settings where you know, okay, this has a lot of action in it. I'm going to do it this way. This one is just a black screen with white text, so I'm going to do it this way. This one is just someone sitting at a desk talking, so I'm going to do it this way. So you'll have some settings that you can use to get the smallest file size possible for internet streaming and for just archiving and doing a few other things. And you'll also be able to get the best quality you can at the smallest file size. And remember, we want to balance those out. So it's no good if you have a huge blocky mess on the computer screen that no one can watch because it's just so ugly, but it's only 200 kilobytes. Yeah, that's no good. You want to balance these things out and get the smallest file size you can while maintaining as good a quality as you can. And when you do that, you'll find that you get kind of the best of both worlds. And that's how I go out and change eternity. Until next time, this is Paul Allen Clifford with TrinityDigitalMedia.com.